everyone, this is Hua welcoming you back to my channel. Happy New Year to everyone near and far, and thank you for sharing your photos of the new year on social media for those of us who can't attend. I love all of your outfits. They are so beautiful. This year is definitely 半岛毛 year. Today's story is called Spoils of War, and this was actually a movie script I wrote about 12 years ago. I sent this to director Mo Lee to make into a film, but he had replied back that with budgeting, he may not be able to make this masterpiece something I'd be proud of. So I kept it on the back burner, and today I am going to share it with you. This story introduces us to Pa Kou, a new widow, a mother of four, who discovers someone she doesn't know at her husband's funeral and comes to learn about the man she thought she knew. Little by little, a secret tale is woven by this strange woman who claims to be a part of her husband's past, and she discovers that the man she loved was someone greater than she could ever know. I invite you to sit back and enjoy the story with me. And once again, thank you for your support through the years. I'm so thankful for all of you.
Think about me one more time before you go. Someday you'll know. Someday you'll know. I already know what I'm going to say. I've been feeling this way for far too long. And now you're gone. Took me away from all of my fears. Kept me away from all of my tears. Now you're gone. And now I'm lost.
From afar, it looked like the gathering of a small party to pray, but upon closer look, there were mourners surrounding an open gravesite, waiting for the last words to be said before the grave was to be closed up forever. The wind was bitter as it blew across the Minnesota land that the mourners stood on. Pa Kou wiped her eyes as they lowered the casket that contained her husband of 34 years into the cold ground, to be buried forever. In her hand, she held a small white rose, a last goodbye. When the casket hit the ground, she felt a hard thud in her heart, making her gasp for breath. Her daughter, Lee, held her hand as she sobbed quietly. She didn't know when, but the rose fell from her hand and into the dark hole. The last thing she saw was its white petals waving its last goodbye as it joined her husband. Then the dirt came over the casket, forever closing it. She lifted her eyes up and saw a figure in the far corner of the cemetery, wearing all black, hiding in the trees. She frowned as she watched the woman who looked to be crying. Pa Kou forced her daughter's hand away and she started walking toward the woman. "Mom?" Lee asked. Pa Kou didn't hear anything as she walked toward the other woman standing in the hidden trees. The September wind whipped across her face as she came closer to her. Upon face to face, Pa Kou realized this woman was crying. Her eyes were red, swollen, and puffy. Her hands were gathered around a wad of tissues, and her face looked sad and fragile. She wore all black, clothing to reveal sadness and pain, just like hers. "Who are you? What are you doing here? I think I saw you at my husband's funeral too," Pa Kou asked. The woman stepped forward, but then decided against it. She gathered up her strength and looked up at Pa Kou. "I'm sorry to scare you, but I knew your husband. I was just paying my respects." She frowned. "How did you know my husband?" "I tell you, but are you not forgetting that by talking to me you'll miss the last moments of your husband?" That was when Pa Kou turned around to find her children knelt down on the ground sobbing. Without another word, she walked back toward the gravesite and helped her children stand up. When she turned back around, the woman was gone. She sighed deeply as she looked at the fresh dirt that now held her husband. She picked up a white rose from the ground and laid it on the dirt. Come on, children. It's time to go, she said. Pa Kou lay in bed, listening to the sounds the house was making, and inside she cringed. She stared at the empty side beside her and felt the fresh tears coming once again. It wasn't too long ago that if she was scared, she could reach over and he'd be right there to offer his hand. Sobbing, she turned her face into the pillow that once held his head. Her hands ran down the sheet where his body used to lie, and as every finger brushed against the fabric, her heart tore at the thought of never feeling him again. When the sobs turned into compulsive gasps and then to hiccups, she knew she was far gone to return back. But how could she help it? She needed him, and he was no longer there. When the sobs finally subsided, she lay in bed wondering how people ever went on with their lives after a loved one had passed away. She found comfort in the smell she got from his pillow, and finally, after hours of crying and sobbing, she found a small piece of sleep enter her. And as always, she dreamt of him. She dreamt of their life together. Their laughter could be heard over an ocean, and their love made time stand still. He was perfect in every way, in a way a human couldn't be perfect. Flawless, it seemed. He was protective of her, always protecting her, always making sure she was safe. She dreamt of his love, of his life, and their time spent together. And as always, she woke up feeling lost, lonely, and sad. Lee entered her mother's house with her 4-month-old daughter in her arms and her 1-year-old son trailing behind her. She turned on the lights and some small dusting came from the bulbs and onto the ground. She ushered her son in and closed the door behind him. She set her daughter down on the baby rocker and had her son sit next to her as she turned the TV set on. "I'll be right back. Watch your sister," she said. Flea walked to the kitchen and found it empty and silent. She opened up the fridge and noticed that all the food she had bought for her mom had not been consumed. She closed the door and walked up the stairs to where her mother slept. She knocked on the door and then entered. Her mother was sitting on the edge of the bed wearing a white cotton gown, her long black hair down and her head bent. "Mom?" Flea asked. Her mother remained silent and still as she entered the room. She walked around to the other side and found her mother's face in ruins, tears streaking her wrinkled face, and her eyes hollow and empty. Flea sobbed and pulled her mother in for a long hug, holding her fragile body as she tried hard to comfort her mother. "Mom, it's gonna be okay," she said as she pulled away. "Dad won't be back, but you still have us." "It's not the same thing, Flea. You can't heal me like your dad does," her mother replied. "I know that, Mom. I know that. But you can't do this to yourself. It's not healthy, and I love you too much to see you like this. Please, leave me. I'm tired and I just want to sleep. Go, please." When Lee came down the stairs, her younger sister Gosheng had arrived with her 2-year-old son. She looked up as Lee came to sit down beside her, feeling sad. "What's wrong?" Gosheng asked. "Mom was upstairs crying. I just feel so bad that I can't do more for her." Gosheng moved over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's hurting, and I think it's best if we just let her be alone for a while. She probably just wants some time to gather up her thoughts. I'm sure she'll be up and around again in no time. But she doesn't eat, Gosheng, and that's what worries me." Before Gosheng could answer, there was a knock on the door, startling both women. They looked at each other for a moment before Lee got up and answered the door. A woman stood there with a wide-brimmed hat, wearing a black suit, a woman who looked of a higher class. Lee stared at her, wondering where she'd seen this woman, and then it occurred to her that it was at her father's funeral. "You were at my dad's funeral," Lee said. The woman nodded. "Is your mother home? I'd like to speak to her." "She is, but she's resting right now. How can I help you?" "May I come in?" Lee stepped aside and the woman came in. She walked in and introduced her to her sister. "And you are?" "My name is Meina. I knew your father when he was young," she said. Again, both girls exchanged looks. "What does that mean?" Gosheng asked. "It's a very long story, and I'd like to share it with you. but I also would like to share it with your mother too. See, your father, he saved me from death. During the run from Laos to Thailand, he saved me from meeting the same fate as my family. Let me take you upstairs, Gosheng said. Pa Kou heard the door open and she turned around about to tell her daughter she wanted to be left alone. But the woman entering her room wasn't her daughter. It was a woman from the cemetery. Pa Kou stood up as she entered and then closed the door behind her. The woman was once a beautiful woman, but now had aged to perfection. Her hair was still long and black and still shiny and sleek. She wore a very nice black suit with a white hat, and when she removed the hat, Pa Kou saw the laugh lines and the lines of life on her face. Who are you? Pa Kou asked. The woman stepped forward. I'm sorry for coming this way and meeting you like this. It was never my intention, but there is something so beautiful here that I can't allow to die with your husband. How do you know him? Was he a secret lover of yours? Pa Kou asked, already waiting for the worst. She laughed. No, he wasn't a secret lover of mine. Pa Kou let out a breath of relief. But he was once my lover, she added. She fell to the bed, shaking as fear entered her. She turned and looked at a picture of her husband on the dresser and felt immediately betrayed. Please don't think of it that way. He was more my savior than my lover. I have so much to tell you. There's so much you need to know. What do you mean? My name is Mei Na Vang. Pa Kou looked up when she spoke her name, fear hitting her close to her heart more than ever. She stood up again and stared at the woman before her, realizing how beautiful this woman was compared to her. Her skin, even at an old age, was flawless. She was so elegant, and everything about her was completely timeless. You're Mei Na? Pa Kou asked. Yes. Did he tell you about me? No, but I've heard him speak your name through sleep. I once asked him about it, and he denied ever saying your name. But here you are. Here you stand, before me, in the flesh. Mei Na walked forward, setting her hat down on the dresser. Please don't think ill of me, and don't let me ruin your memory of your life with him. He was, after all, your husband, not mine. I knew him for such a small time, but he saved me in more ways than anyone could ever save another person. How do you mean? He kept me alive until I reached the land of Thailand. Pa Kou watched as tears filled the other woman's eyes, her pretty face distorted in painful memories, as she stared at the picture of her husband on the dresser. Would you share it with me? Mei Na looked up and smiled. I would love to. That was one reason why I came here to talk to you. I needed to tell you about Pao, and that he saved me from death. Jungles of Laos, 1954. The world around Mei Na was quiet as she lay there in the darkened forest. Her breathing seemed to have stopped as she listened to the bullets flying around her. Her hands clutched an old dried up wood for safety, although what it could protect her from she wasn't sure. Her parents were a few feet away from her lying quietly, and her baby brother was in her mother's arms. When she looked up at the opening of the trees, she could see the full white moon glaring down at her in pity. She felt tears enter her eyes as she tried hard to control her fear. She felt something crawl on her, and she shifted her eyes to her left arm. A large green caterpillar was making its way up, slowly as if tracing all of her lines. A scream entered her mouth, but she clamped her mouth down with her hand and shook her arm. She saw the caterpillar fly off and felt a small sense of relief as she panted hard. Mei Na, let's go, her father whispered. She got up and followed her parents in the dark as they led the way to freedom. Twigs and branches poked at her, ripping her shirt, and her hand was dried wood, and she used it to block the twigs from scratching her face. Rocks dug into her feet, but she felt nothing. She looked at her mother and saw her baby brother's toothless grin, and she wondered how he felt. Did he know fear? Did he even know that tonight could be their last night alive? She couldn't help but smile back at his innocent face. They stopped at a flowing river up ahead to drink. Maynard cupped a handful of water, and as it flowed down her dry body, she felt renewed and alive. She washed her face and neck, feeling cooler and better. She watched as her brother played in the water, splashing. "Stop the child from making too much noise," her father whispered. Her mother pulled him from the water and held him as he started to fuss. She pulled off her shirt and stuck her nipple into his mouth, and he stopped to feed. Maynard looked at the surrounding around her, and she felt a fear settle inside her again. She and her family had been running for 3 whole nights, stopping only to get water and some sleep. During the mornings, they hid in caves, hoping no one would see them. She was tired and hungry. There were still some dry rice cakes, but it would have to be saved for tomorrow. She took another gulp of water and filled her empty stomach. "Let's go," her father said. Once again, they were on the run for their lives, for their freedom. She felt her legs get heavy and fatigue hit her as the night drew on. The moon lit the way, and she saw the tree branches reaching out like ghosts, threatening to take a mortal into hell. The jagged path was covered with rocks and twigs that dug into their feet. Twice she fell, and twice she bled. The night was ending soon, and they needed a place for safety. Up ahead, her father stopped them. Someone was close by. "Mai, take the children and follow this path. Up there should be a cave. You need to go hide there," he said. Her mother looked at him with fear in her eyes. "And where are you going, Dang?" "There's someone close by. Go." When her mother began to argue, her father turned to her. "Mena, take your mother and go, now. There's someone here that's close enough to harm us. Stay where you are and I'll come find you. Do not come out even if you hear something. Do you understand?" She started crying, and he grabbed her hand. "Do you understand?" he repeated. "Yes, Dad, I understand." Mena reached for her mother's shaking hands and drew her toward the area where her father wanted them to go. She could feel her mother's fear, and she knew her own. She knew she would never see her father again, and that he would never live to find them. As they made their way across the darkened path and terrains, they came across a small cave opening, and Maynard helped her crying mother to the cave. Her brother was sleeping, and she lay him down, and then she took her mother into her arms. "Mom, don't cry. They'll hear us," she said. It was quiet around them as her mother's sobs subsided. It was so quiet. The only sound was the crickets singing. And then they heard the sound of soldiers shouting orders, and both curled up their legs and held each other tight. Loud sounds of jolly laughter filled the air that made Mayna's stomach turn. And then they heard the single gunshot. Her mother gasped softly as they held each other, and her own tears flowed down her cheeks, staining her mother's black hair. In the moonlight, her mother looked like a small child curled up against her. Mayna's tears flowed down her cheeks, making her shiver, and thoughts of her father entered her mind. She didn't get to say one single goodbye, and he was gone, dead, forever in the land where he loved. She wiped her eyes, and in the darkness, her tears looked black. Her mother was still shivering and sobbing softly in the dark. Both were sitting, shivering from the loss of a great man. When morning came, Mayna woke up alone with her brother. Her mother was gone, and she sat up quickly, fear settling inside her. She looked around, searching for any sign of her mother. Her brother was still sleeping as she got up and out of the cave, making sure no one was around. And then she saw her mother knelt down a few feet away. She slowly walked over and saw that her father's body had been dumped there, a single gunshot wound to the temple. Mayna's tears flowed down as she knelt down beside her mother and took her father's cold hand in hers. He was pale, no life inside him. His hands were frozen, and his eyes were left wide open. A fly buzzed over him, and Mayna swapped it away. She reached over and closed her father's eyelids as her mother tried hard to control her sobs, trying hard not to make any noise. She pulled her mother's hand and pulled her up. "Mom, we have to get going. We have to go," Mayna said. Mayna walked ahead while her mother followed with her brother on her back. The day was hot and warm as they followed the trail, trying to make sure no one was there to harm them. When they reached the river, a small family was there taking a break. "How long have you been traveling?" one of the men asked. 4 days and 3 nights, her mother answered. "Are you two alone?" Where's your husband? Her mother's face broke as she answered, He was shot last night. He was trying to protect us, and now we have no one. You're welcome to travel with us since you are just two women. Thank you. Maina took her brother from her mother's back and put him in the river, washing him with the cool water. He played and giggled, looking up at her, and she felt sad by the thought that he would never know his own father. As she cupped a handful of water to rinse his head, she heard the others shout to hide, and when she turned, she saw the gun smoke from a distance. She picked up her brother and held him in her arms as she dashed for cover under some bushes. Bullets rippled through the air, hissing as it landed into the river, splashing water across the dry land. She held his small body in her arms and pulled her legs into the bushes. That was when she heard the loud stomping of the soldiers, and when she peeked out from under the bushes, she saw the man who had spoken to her mother, standing in the river, knee-deep. Oh no, she whispered to herself. 6 guns were pointing to him as he stood there with his arms raised up. One of the soldiers laughed and slammed the handle of his gun against the man's face. Blood gushed down, staining the river a crimson tide. Maynard closed her eyes as she heard grunts and blows. When she opened her eyes again, one of the soldiers was standing behind him with a knife, and with one swift move, he slit the man's throat. Thick red blood flowed from the open wound down his neck, into his shirt, and onto the river. And then he fell over, dead. The soldiers waited for a moment to see if anyone else was around before walking away. It wasn't until after a moment when she realized something was soaking her clothes. She bent down and looked at her brother. A gasp entered her mouth as she realized she was covered in blood. A thick soak had begun to stain her chest. She pulled her small brother's body away and realized a single bullet had gone through his temple and out the other side without her even noticing. She started crying as his little face looked up at her with no life. She crawled out from under the bushes and saw her mother's horrified look as she stood up with her brother's weightless body in her arms. Blood began soaking through her fingers and onto the river, making droplets like rain. No! Her mother cried as Maynard brought her brother to her mother. In the end, her little brother had met the same fate as her father, a bullet through the head. Maynard watched as her mother mourned her dead son, and the other family members mourned their dead father. The river was red with blood as she stood there, knee-deep, staring at the river that stained the life of her brother. It was in the middle of afternoon when they reached a small cave opening. Maynard and her mother followed the others into the cave and shared their food. It was late in the day when Maynard crawled up beside her mother and held her blood-stained hands. Mom, what's going to happen to us? Maynard asked. I don't know anymore, and frankly, I don't care if I live or die. Enough has been taken away from me. Why is this happening to us? Her mother turned to her and touched her face. It's an unfair world, Maynard. Always remember that. But I want you to promise me something. What? You promise me that you will go on with life, no matter how much death you've seen. Tears entered her eyes as her mother smiled at her. Why are you talking like that? Because I want you to see that life is beautiful and worth living for every moment you have. I want you to live and love. Love is the most wonderful thing that can happen to you. And one day I promise you that you'll find a man who will make you feel as if anything is possible. Maynard grabbed her mother's hand. And what about you? I'll be here. I'm always here. But I want you to promise me that you will never forget what I've said. With shaking hands, she replied, I promise. Night arrived quicker than before, and Maynard and her mother ran with the others. The moon lit the way through the sorrowful jungles that held life and death for them. The path was raw with rocks, and it tore at their feet, slashing open wounds, but the run for their life was far more important. They cut through a dark patch of forest, and Maynard could smell the rotting flesh. As they ran through, she felt her feet squishing into the rotting bodies, stepping on intestines, blood, and mucus left from the rotting dead. Once she fell and stared at a young girl's hollow, open eyes. When they finally ran past, she felt she could breathe again. She stared at her feet, and in the moon's lighting she could see it was covered in blood and maggots. She cried out and shook her feet, the maggots flying off in different directions. They came across a river and crossed, the water washing the blood off her feet. As they made it across, bullets ricocheted and caught the bodies of the family she and her mother were traveling with. The bodies landed in the water, splashing, staining it a dark color as she looked behind her. She ran ahead with her mother behind her. Shouts of angry soldiers could be heard close by, and the bullets that fired were loud and ear-deafening as she ran. Mena, run! Don't look back! Her mother cried. She ran, her legs carrying her as fast as she could. The trees looked like angry ghosts tossing death into her face. The leaves whipped her, and the ground bled her feet. Mena reached for her mother's hand, and they both ran, fearing for the worst, hoping to see freedom soon. She felt the bullet graze her across the shoulder, and she cried out as she fell to the ground. What happened? Her mother shouted. I'm hit, she whispered as her mother helped her stand up. She felt the blood rushing down her right arm as her mother pulled her toward a dark opening. Bushes and trees hid the opening from afar, and her mother pushed her in. As she reached for her mother's hand, she backed away from it. Mom, what are you doing? Mena cried. Mena, I love you. You are my daughter, and I want you to see how beautiful this life is. Promise me that you will live it, she cried. Mena shook her head as tears filled her eyes. No, 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 Mom. I can't go on without you. You can't leave me here, Mom. Mom, you can't leave me here. Do as I say. Remember, I love you. Mena took a step out as her mother gathered the bushes to hide her. The last image she saw of her mother was her hair swaying from left to right as she ran for her life into the darkness. She held her breath as she saw the shadows of the soldiers with guns run past her and into the direction where her mother had fled. She started sobbing quietly, no longer feeling the pain in her arm. She panted hard, trying to control her breathing as she stared up at the dark sky and the thick bushes that surrounded her. She couldn't feel any more pain. It was all gone from her, completely drained. She was now alone in a fight for freedom. It was morning when Mena woke from her sleepless night. She pushed herself up from the thick bushes and winced from the pain in her arm. She fought her way out and saw a thick fog before her. It was cold and quiet as she walked onward in the direction where she last saw her mother. In the morning light, she saw the dead bodies from last night's massacre. The family she had been traveling with lay dead, one on top of the other, blood soaked through their shirts, flies buzzing around. She turned around and walked on until she saw her mother's body hung on a tree branch. A sob escaped from her mouth as she ran to her mother's body. She had been stabbed and then hung. Mena fought the ropes that held her mother's body but couldn't break it free. Don't do that, a male voice said. Mena turned around and saw a young man standing not a few feet away, a gun in his hand. She lowered her hands as he stepped forward, and she took several steps back, frightened. He raised his hand to stop her. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm on the same side as you are. Mena felt the tears run down her face as she lifted her eyes to her mother and then back at him. You have to help me take her down. She was my mother. I can't let her be like this. You can't do that. If you do, they will know someone was here. I know how much it hurts you, but you have to come with me if you want to live. I don't have much, but together we can survive, better than if we go separate. And I have a weapon. Mena shook her head and started crying. I can't go and leave her like this. You don't have a choice. And then he looked at her. You're bleeding. Come on, if they spot us, they can trace your blood. Now let's go. He tore off a piece of his shirt and tied it around her wound. We have to go. Mena looked once more at her mother's face and then followed him. She turned back and saw her mother's lifeless body slowly swaying in the open wind. Goodbye, Mother. I promise you, Mom. I promise I will live. What's your name? He asked her when they were sitting inside a hidden cave. He took out some dry rice cakes and handed one to her. Mena, what's yours? I'm Pao. On our way to Thailand, my family was killed. I'm the only survivor. Me too. Mayna ate her rice cakes, and then she turned to examine the man sitting before her. It occurred to her that he wasn't really a man, still so much a young boy who was forced to grow up too fast. She noticed that he was quite handsome. Not rugged, just handsome. She had never been this close to a boy before, and it scared her a little, adding some rush to her already pounding heart. How are we going to escape? She asked after a while. Pao looked up, licking his lips. We run until we reach the Mekong River. From there on, it should be easier, I hope. Do you have family in Thailand? No, I'll be alone. But I'm not afraid. I can survive. You're very brave, she whispered. So are you. How's your arm? She looked at the blood-soaked rag and he moved closer to examine it. He removed the rag and tore off another piece from his shirt. He retied the wound and tossed the old rag away. Thank you, Mena said.
I don't know if I can make it when I walk alone. Oh, can somebody come and save me? I just wanna know. I wanna know if I could run through the fire, I could conquer the night. If I can make it, if I try to draw the red lights. I don't know if I can make
Present.
it when I walk alone.
Pa Kou stared at Mena as she wiped her eyes. She couldn't imagine the pain and horror this woman must have felt